So we get to my beloved Saints, and I want to find ways to say X, Y, and Z player will be superstars, but I'll try my best to be impartial. That being said, if the Saints do want to win it all sometime soon, I think it is time to address a few things, and it's always good to take a step back, reassess, and see where you're at. My name's Woody, this is Wooden Spoon Data with the 18th best AFL content on YouTube, and in today's video, we are joined by Jake from Saints TV. How are you doing today, Jake?
I'm doing good, mate. I'm doing very good. It's good to be on here with you. This is the perfect time for Sainers. This is where we're at our most optimistic, so it couldn't be better, really. You know, nothing's happened yet.
So in this video, we'll be taking a look back at the best 22 St Kilda could put together in 2024 to see where they excelled and where they might still need to improve. We can also add the players acquired in the off-season to see what sort of changes they might bring to the St Kilda side in 2025, and if that'd be enough to get them back competing for a top 4 spot. To do this, I've made a simple spreadsheet to compare St Kilda's players against the average player in the same position. We can also compare each player against a top 4 player in the same position from the last 5 years. I have taken some liberties to include best 22 players that missed large chunks of the season in 2024, but I've tried to have minor influence. So basically, I've taken every stat and every position and then compared stats between an average player in a given position and a top 4 player from the same position in the last 5 years to determine what stats are important for each position. For example, Rowan Marshall had 31 out of 43 important ruck stats above the average ruck this past year. But that drops to 29 out of 43 if we were to raise the average to a top 4 ruck over the last 5 years. The average ruck had 5.84 handballs per match last year. Marshall had 5.91, therefore was more than the average 2024 ruck. But if we compare him to a top 4 ruck over the last 5 years, where the average has been 6.37, he is lower than an average top 4 ruck. Make sense? Good. So we did that for every position and every stat we deemed important for each position. Finally, once we determined the best 22 the Saints could field last year and this coming, we can compare the players selected as a whole against the average production from a top 4 side from the last few years. So let's start with defence. St Kilda's key defenders this past year were Callum Wilkie and the now departed Josh Battle with 23 games, Dougal Howard with 15 matches, and Zane Cordy with 8. With a total of 69 matches played across all their key defenders this past year, we can divide that number by 23 and determine the Saints average 3 key position defenders per match and prefer that structure. St Kilda added key defenders / wingmen Alix Tauru and James Barrat, but did not add a key defender with AFL experience to their list this off-season. Looking at matches played, there were 3 clear leaders in Wilkie, Battle and Howard. So we'll have them in the 2024 lineup, but obviously we can't keep those 3 key position defenders for 2025, so who gets the 3rd role? Well, Cordy could go in there, but I think this goes to a younger player to start developing them, and therefore will be occupied by one of the 2 new draftees, or maybe Ari Schoenmaker. Considering this is a comparison, I'm sure many of you might be asking how I'm going to project Tauru or Barrat's output if they haven't played a match yet. Which, good question. I've explained it in previous videos though, so if you want to get more in-depth answers, go back and watch them. But I'm going to be somewhat lazy. Because I don't have a good way to project lower level stats to AFL level, I'm going to take the first year stats of the players they were compared to prior to the draft. Zero Hanger compared Tauru to James Sicily and Barrat to Noah Bolter, so we'll be taking their first year stats. I said it a few times now, but if you have any better ideas, let me know. Looking at important stats above average for key defenders last year, there isn't too much to worry about, particularly with Wilkie being ahead of target for everything but tackles. Howard was obviously the weakest link, being behind for intercept possessions, contested and intercept marks, tackles and pressure acts. But don't get me wrong, he has his moments, but there is still room for improvement. Getting to the loss of Battle, this in my opinion will be pretty hard to replace, but at least there's options now, whereas last year might have been different. If we look at Ari's numbers from last year and Barrat and Tauru's projected numbers, all will have areas to improve. In my opinion, St Kilda most likely plays all of these players at different points through the year, depending on injury or form. But what's your thoughts, Jake? Do you think a specific player has locked down that role yet?
Not yet. Ari's training well. He's kind of fast-tracked it and he's sort of the one that everyone's taking note of at the moment, his performance and his professionalism. which was in question when we drafted him. So he's really come a long way since then, which is really good to see. He's put on some size, which is important. Speed is still a bit of a worry. You know, he's probably not the quickest defender going around. James Barrat looks like he's got a bit of a spring in his step and he can fly. And he's probably better one-on-one. He's probably more physically that's why they liken him to a bolter, I suppose, is he can go toe-to-toe with the bigger boys, whereas Ari's probably more your rebounding defender and not so much your accountable defender. It probably depends on the opponent, I suppose, because not every week we're going to be playing teams with 2 or 3 power forwards. There might be 1 or 2. Wilkie, Howard takes it, and then you can afford to have an Ari float or even debut a Barrat and mix it up. I don't know. Could you play both? Could you do Ari and Barrat in certain weeks? Or is that chaos?
I do think there is opportunity there. If one of those 3 can really earn Ross's trust, potentially he could look at playing more than one of them, but I don't think we'd see that for a while. For now, and the sake of the best numbers possible for 2025, the third key position defensive role will go to Barrat. I've mentioned it in other videos, so I won't go over exact numbers here, as they're a bit more speculative, but while Schoenmaker does have slightly better numbers at first glance, when you look at the sum of important player stats above an average top 4 team at the end of everything, Schoenmaker ended up being a -2 if swapped with Barrat. At the end of the day, Schoenmaker is young, and as Jake mentioned, by all reports is developing quite nicely this offseason. So I think these numbers do a reasonable job at representing his growth, if given that role anyway. Now let's move on to St Kilda's medium defenders. This past year, Jack Sinclair, Nazaya Wanganeen-Malera, Liam Stocker, Jimmy Webster, and Riley Bonner all played 15 games or more, with the previously mentioned Ari Schoenmaker and Ben Patton playing 4 matches, and Angus McClellan with just the 2. With a total of 104 matches played across all their medium defenders this past year, again dividing by 23, we can determine the Saints average and prefer 4.52 medium defenders per match. St Kilda added medium defender / midfielder Tobie Travaglia at pick 8 in the national draft, but did not add a medium defender with AFL experience to their list this offseason. Rookie Me compared Travaglia to Will Day, so we'll be taking his first year stats and coming back to him in a second. Looking at stats above average, there's an obvious 2 that make the team in Sinclair and Wanganeen-Malera, so clearly they make the side in both years, but who joins them? I've already mentioned it briefly, but the general goal is to put together the best sides for both years and measure improvement, or not. So when you look at the sum of important player stats above an average top 4 team, I couldn't find a way to include 4 medium defenders. At least not in 2024. Bonner and Patton are gone. Schoenmaker is somewhat accounted for in the 2025 lineup and didn't outright get a spot for 2024. Same for McClellan, so we're left with just Webster or Stocker. Stocker ended up being a -1 if swapped with Webster in 2024, with disposals per clanger going from +2 to -7. This is mostly because Webster gets just over 13 disposals per match and less than 1 clanger per game, to similar disposal numbers from Stocker, but he gets just over 2 clangers per match. So Jake, I know you've had a few chats re the Stocker-Webster debate. What's your thoughts?
It's always a head scratcher. I remember doing my predicted lineup 2023, and that was kind of the main talking point. And then even the start of this year, it was the same. But then you kind of see Stocker moving slowly into the centre bounce at times back end of this season. And I think maybe that's the evolution of where he's going to go. And I mean, he looks like he's running a lot of laps, probably, trying to build that tank up again to be a midfielder. I still think he can play that roll down back, but I think if we are going to play a back pocket, pure back pocket, it will be Jimmy Webster. I think it's just the proven experience. He doesn't get beaten. He uses the ball well. He's actually the perfect Ross line player. Ross can just tell him what to do and he'll do it. Stocker, I think, can have that evolution of maybe both worlds, but more midfield time. He's just a bit of a battering ram. He makes us look like a better team when he's in there throwing his weight around and getting clearances. So yeah, we can't play both with Angus coming through as well. A bit of competition from the VFL.
Yeah, and I love seeing him fly the flag for us, but Stocker did have a similar problem in 2025. With Membry departing, there was an extra spot in that lineup, and we'll discuss Membry more later. That being said, Stocker ended up being a -1 if swapped with Travaglia in 2025, as with the stats we've given to Travaglia, he'd likely get more bounces per match and have slightly higher overall goal accuracy, taking those from negative to positives. Stocker was a positive for tackles, where he'd average 0.85 more, but I think his main competition would be Webster, who is remaining in the 2025 side. Again, I'll explain this in further depth at the end, but that's why Webster gets the third and final medium defensive role in 2024, and why Stocker doesn't get into the 2025 side over Travaglia. Considering there will be no more changes in defense, we might as well change everyone's numbers to their top 4 above average numbers going forward. So let's have a look at the medium defender versus top 4 medium defensive comparison charts before looking at the overall defensive output changes. I'll start with the upside. Naz and Sinclair are pretty much in the positive, or near enough, across the board, and are rated as the 2nd and 13th best medium defenders from last year's AFL player ratings. There are some stats where there is room for improvement this year, especially when it comes to the development of the younger players. For example, a couple extra tackles and score launches would certainly go a long way. That being said, St Kilda did have the equal highest score percentage from defensive half, yet overall they were only 15th in points for. But the major issue I see is defensive 1v1 loss percentage, where Naz and Webster were equal 6th last and 10th amongst medium defenders with 15 games or more. This is where I can see an opportunity for Stocker if he can lock down on opposition small forwards. We touched on him before, but you mentioned Stocker does a reasonably good job as a lockdown midfielder. Jake, what do you think he's missing as a lockdown defender?
Speed. That's what Jimmy has. Jimmy has that over him. Sinks has that over him. Naz has that over him. Ben Patton had that over him. So speed is a big one. Would you put him on Charlie Cameron? No. The ball hits the deck. Charlie's gone. Papley's gone. We need someone that is physically tough but can keep their feet and is nimble enough to chase the bloke down and not get your ankles broken. And no disrespect to Stocker, but that's just not his game. His game isn't pace. His game isn't speed. It's physical. It's tackling and chasing, but yeah, I'd rather not focus on the chasing end too much with him. I think that's probably why Ross preferences Webster as well. There's another element to it. He's a kick. He's probably better one-on-one, but he's also quicker. And we want to be a quick team, quick rebounding team that can also get back and then get forward. So you got to run both ways. I don't see Stocker probably fitting the bill in that aspect yet, but again, we're working very hard on our fitness at the moment, as has been well documented. So who knows? He might come back a few kilos lighter and ready to go. So
now it's time to look at the defensive groups as a whole and compare years. Looking at the differences between the charts, touching on the positives, tackles, score involvements, and score launches all look to slightly go up, with contested marks remaining about the same. But it does look like pretty much everything else does go down. As I mentioned earlier, I do think Battle will be hard to replace. My major worry is going to be intercept possessions, which look to drop by about 4.5 per match, and intercept marks, which look to drop by just over 2. While I don't think this will entirely change St Kilda's defensive structure, I do think his form position will change hands quite a few times between Tauru, Barrat, and Schoenmaker. I also think St Kilda might experiment with smaller lineups, either by design or necessity. So what's your thoughts here, Jake?
That's assuming that our midfield's still struggling and we're allowing in easy inside 50s, which if that improves, less inside 50s, less quality of inside 50, probably less of a need for intercept marking.
So before we get onto the mids, let's quickly touch on the sum of St Kilda's defensive output. In 2024, the sum of the Saints' defensive output had 25 out of 37 important defensive stats above that of the top 4 defence. With this lineup in 2025, the Saints' defensive output would see them drop to 20 out of 37 important defensive stats above a top 4 defence. Okay, so let's get on to the mids. This year, Jack Steele, Hunter Clark, Marcus Windhager, Paddy Dow, Seb Ross, Ryan Burns, and Zach Jones all played over 11 games, with Angus Hastie playing 5 and Brad Crouch just playing the 1. I know Hastie could be classed differently, and I've looked into his numbers in a few roles. That is just how the AFL and Champion Data does things, and you'll probably see more of that soon. The Saints added former dog Jack Macrae, and we'll come back to him in a moment. They also drafted WA prospect Hugh Boxshall to their midfield stocks this offseason, and look, maybe I'm way off the mark here, but I don't see him being an immediate best 22 selection, so I'm not going to say much more. As you've seen, I'd normally total up the matches played across all the midfielders, divide by 23 and determine how many midfielders the Saints prefer to play. But we're going to need to be a bit flexible in positionings here. Even before looking at the top 4 above average most important mid stats, there's a clear leader in captain Jack Steele, and then Hunter Clark leads the next brigade, so he makes the 2024 side as well, but we might have to come back to him in a moment. So who else makes the 2024 side? I think most Saints fans agree, despite him being classed as a mid-medium forward, Mattaes Philippou finished in the midfield last year and probably starts there this year, but his stats don't exactly look great. So let's have a look at just his last 5 matches to see the difference. If we do that, we can see a massive increase in his numbers, jumping him to about as important as Clark, if not more so. And when comparing the sum of important player stats above an average top 4 team at the end of everything, the difference in his numbers is a +5 alone. So, I mean, clearly he makes both years. But Jake, what sort of changes do you think happened when he came back into the side?
Backed himself. I mean, it's a cliche, but he read the ball. He was probably quicker making decisions. He wasn't a pedestrian in the first half of the year. He probably looked like he was thinking of the first option and then thinking the second, the third, the fourth. And by that point, you lose all your options. You get tackled or your kick's just a dumb kick down the line. And in the second half of the year, he took it, backed himself, went for that first option, either go for goal, hit the target. He was more aggressive. He built his tank up as well. And I think this time last year, that was the thing probably was the biggest question mark was, all right, yeah, we want Mattaes to be this full-time midfielder, but can he run out a game? Can he do it? And we didn't know that. Now he's gone into the VFL. He's stuck to strictly midfield time because we all forget when he debuted and he played every game. He played most games, if not every game, forward pocket, half forward flank. He didn't play through the guts. Now we're putting him prime time midfield, so it's a big step up. So, yeah, I think he's just growing into that role naturally. You know, it's not a great answer, but I think sometimes you just got to play games and you're going to have good games and then they're going to build up into great games.
Yeah, so I tend to agree. But who gets the last 2 spots for 2024? While Crouch might have technically gotten a spot, considering he only played the 1 match, he misses out. Of the players mentioned earlier, Windhager and Dow were the next best individually and for the team overall, so they're going to make it, but I'm going to give them bench roles, and we probably have to come back to them too. On the wings for both years, I've got Bradley Hill and Mason Wood, who are both classified as mid-medium forwards. But as you can see, they were the next best options as mids, other than Darcy Wilson and Liam Henry, who were also classified as mid-medium forwards. So that is why we have to be flexible with positioning, and we'll come back to some of those players soon. Before we start comparing years, we need to have a look at who Macrae comes in for, and that's where we get back to the Clark, Windhager, and Dow discussion. As a general, I think many Saints fans would go with their heart and pick the boys we drafted, but when I was looking at the stats, coming back to the sum of everything at the end of it all, Windhager made the team, but Clark didn't, as he was a -1 compared with Dow. Dow just had slightly better hitouts gathered and disposal efficiency stats. Again, I think these 3 players will rotate 2 spots based on injury or performance. Now, Jakey, I know you're a big Clark fan. What's your thoughts about this?
No Clark. I couldn't say that I'd go with that. I couldn't say that I could foresee a team that doesn't include the uniqueness of that type of player. His stats probably, again, he's growing into the role. It's a weird thing. It's kind of like, it was kind of his first real run in the guts as well. You know, when you think about it, he's been in the system so long, but he hasn't had that run. So if he gets that run this year, who knows what type of player he can be. But I do agree that there is going to be some rotation, but it's good. This is battle for spots now. We're getting 3 or 4 players for 2 positions now in every position on the ground. That's what a good team does. So you don't want it to be a given. You don't want to say, oh, this guy's a lock, this guy's a lock. Because that means, oh, okay, it's no other options, you know? Now we've got options. And I think Darcy Wilson will play midfield this year. I think that's been talked about. That's been publicised. That's where he is in training. That's what he's doing. He's playing at the centre bounce, in match sim. He's not playing out on the wings. So I think that's going to be a surprise to some people. We're probably going to see some games where Tobie and Darcy are going to be starting at the bounce. Chaotic, but you probably only do that against Richmond, but it's quite exciting. But yeah, no Hunter Clark. I can't say that. I mean, I'm a big fan, so it hurt my feelings if he missed.
So that's the 2024 and 2025 mid lineups. Considering there will be no more changes to there, we'll change everyone's numbers to their top 4 above average numbers in the position that they are in. So if we look at those players individually, again, focusing where to improve, most of the centre mid group isn't far off with their hitouts gathered, and most of them are pretty close to the mark for centre clearances, particularly if you look at Pooh's last 5 games. Where I worry is the outside players don't seem to be providing enough support near the contest, as Hill and Wood just don't get many total clearances and also seem to be pretty light on in tackles. Inside 50s are also a little bit below target across the board, and I think the breakdown of connection is really shown in the lack on shots on goal. And when looking at disposal efficiency, only Steele and Hill were above a top 4 mid. If we look between years at those mid groups as a whole, the biggest change is disposals going up nearly 7, but we also see handball receives up by 4. Tackles go up by over 3 and pressure acts by 2. Inside 50s score involvement and shots go up too, but not by very much. And we do see ground ball gets and a few other things go down. So in 2024, the sum of St Kilda's midfield output had only 9 out of 42 important midfield stats above that of a top 4 midfield. With this lineup going into 2025, using Pooh's last 5 games as his average, the projected sum of St Kilda's mid group would see them jump to 15 out of 42 important stats above a top 4 mid group. So clearly there's still some work to do in that midfield group, but with Pooh, Windhager, and some of the other youngsters we've mentioned looking at improving, growth could happen rapidly in that area. So what do you think, Jake? Could this be the year that growth happens? And how high do you think we could go if it does? Where's your head at?
Nah, my head's firmly, 6 to 9, 6 to 10. I think that's where our zone is right now. I think that's for next year. I think from 2026 and beyond, when some of these young kids have got some continuity, they got some 40, 50, 60 games under their belts. Some of them are even more. It's hard to believe in a couple of years that Naz and Windy and Owens are going to be pushing 100 games. You know what I mean? Like, that's when we want to be hitting the sweet spot. That's when the window needs to be open and we're ready to go for it, with King in his prime. But I'm just thinking, like you said, like our midfield was 9 and we competed that well to beat some top teams. What can we do even if it's 15? Imagine if it hit 20.
A higher number, even better.
Let's move on to the ruck and see if there's anything more Roma or potentially another player might be able to do. Last year, Rowan Marshall played all 23 matches, but he was joined by Tom Campbell and Jack Hayes for 2 matches each. Both have since left the club, and since St Kilda has picked up Alix Dodson with pick 53 in the national draft, and I believe recently signed South Australia's Margaret medalist Harry Boyd. I've already mentioned it, but it's not impossible to predict junior level stats to AFL level, and while I haven't particularly looked into it, I assume older players might be harder. Maybe they're easier. Either way, I don't know, and while I do understand he might be gearing up for early selection, I just can't do much of a comparison here, so we'll jump straight into some of Rowan's stats. Quickly, before looking at the ruck key stats, as a side note, Marshall had 31 out of 43 stats above an average 2024 ruck, but he also had 29 out of 43 above a top 4 ruck. By himself against a ruck group, he'd also cover 18 out of 43, which is quite high. Getting back to the ruck most important stats chart, Roma's ahead for disposals, contested possessions, total clearances, marks, and pretty much close enough for ground ball gets too. Where he isn't up to standard is hitouts, hitouts to advantage, and to a lesser extent, 1%ers, spoils, and score involvements. He does average 3.043 ruck hardball gets, which is where the ball is grabbed out of the ruck contest, which is way above the average top 4 ruck in 1.51. But he has to make sure he gets that ball to the mids to use it as best as possible, as the mids just have a better disposal efficiency than him. So basically, Roma is good, quite good, but he needs to start giving the mids better opportunities to use their skills. What's your thoughts, Jake? Have I missed anything or been too harsh?
No, I think that's exactly how I would have reported it. He does everything brilliantly around the ground. He's probably a little bit too aggressive with his clearances, so he gets a lot of clearances, but even the AFL experts, Lee Montagne's talked about it on Fox Footy. They cover it very well there, that often they are just massive hacks out of the midfield. And you think about it, if he gets the ball handballs to Steele and Steele just bombs it, we're all fuming. But when Rowe does it, without giving the hands, it's just a good clearance. So, if you got to treat everyone evenly, and if Steely did it, we'd be fuming. We've got to be fuming if he's doing it. He needs to be giving the hands to a Wilson running past, to a Steele running past, to a Macrae. Macrae's going to be there every time next year. That's his bread and butter. The second the ruck gets the ball, on the left side, give it to Macrae, and the game opens up. Because when we're running at a defence, that's so much more dangerous than just a hack ball coming in one-on-one when it's 6v6. It's the new way to play, and we're training it already, which is good to see. But yeah, I think that's always been a bit of a knock on Rowe, is his tap work, the quality of it, and how effective his clearances actually are.
Also, I know there is talk of Marshall playing as a key position forward with Harry Boyd joining, so let's have a look at the forwards and the changes to next year's lineups before we get to any conclusions. St Kilda's key forwards in 2024 were Tim Membry, Cooper Sharman, Anthony Caminiti, and Max King. All of them played over 12 matches, with a total of 64 matches played across all their key forwards this past year. We can divide by 23 and determine the Saints' average and prefer 2.78 key forwards per match. So clearly Membry, Sharman, and King make the side in 2024, but what happens in 2025? Well, we've mentioned Marshall might go forward, but for this exercise, we'll only go with the remaining 2 key forwards in 2024. So we've mentioned who's in the starting 2024 and 2025 key forwards roles. Considering there won't be changes across this role, let's have a look at the key forward chart now. In general, Sharman is a bit behind target for marks inside 50 and is also behind for contested marks and marks on lead, but is otherwise pretty close to what you'd want. The loss of memory seems like it might be mitigated by putting Marshall forward, but you want to see a few of those stats go up, particularly contested marks, marks on lead, offensive 1v1s, and obviously shots and goals. Max had a down year, but his numbers really weren't far off a quality key forward. With a little bit of injury luck, hopefully that changes next season. Before comparing total outputs, let's quickly touch on the mid-medium forwards. The remaining mid-medium forwards for St Kilda this past year were Darcy Wilson, Jack Higgins, Mitch Owens, Liam Henry, and Dan Butler, who all played over 12 matches, with Hugo Garcia playing 9 and Lance Collard playing just the 1. With a total of 159 matches played across all the Saints mid-medium forwards this past year, again dividing by 23, we can determine the Saints average and prefer 6.91 or roughly 7 mid-medium forwards per match. But again, we do have to be flexible with positional numbers. There was a standout 4 in that role being Higgins, Wilson, Owens, and Henry, but who gets the final mid-medium forward role? In my opinion, Hugo Garcia gets that final role being a +2 over Butler, and normally I'd go over which stats they are, but I'd like to mention that he was subbed on 4 out of his 9 matches with less than 35% time on ground in each. Normally that would bring a player down to near unusable in the previous reviews, but in this case it didn't. Jake, I think the Saints have got one here, but what's your thoughts?
Oh, I'm a huge fan. I was very frustrated to see him subbed, or at least be the sub so many times. I am curious though if you could somehow get his numbers from the specific time on ground and then stretch that over a full game and that many games to be like, had he not been the sub and put out that output, what would his numbers be? Because I dare say he'd be in that Mason Wood territory. He'd be right up there, Darcy Wilson in the 30s, like with some of his numbers. I don't know if you've done that, by the way, but if you have, I'd love to see it.
I have actually managed to achieve that, Jake, and we can see that Hugo would be rated as our third best mid-medium forward behind only Wood and Higgins. So that's the 2024 and 2025 lineups. Before we have a look at overalls and conclusions, let's have a look at the mid-medium forwards chart. As mentioned earlier, take Garcia's numbers with a grain of salt. He did only average roughly 40% time on ground. But let's start with the positives. Ground ball gets are good. Pressure acts, score involvements, and total marks are pretty much where you'd want them to be as well. But shots and goals are quite low. Disposals are pretty good, but inside 50s are low and marks inside 50 too. So moving to overall stats, we can see the same things are reflected. This suggests a breakdown of the ball further up the ground. But have I missed the mark here? What do you think, Jake?
It's a mix. The forwards, the talls need to do their job. They need to be crashing the pack. Like I felt like the second part of the year when Owens was flying for it a little bit more, it kind of occupies defenders, the key defenders enough that when the ball does come to ground, there's space for Higgins and Butler. And I felt like that's when we got their form. The going inside 50, that's just our problem at the moment. That's leading, that's moving. Like you said, I was surprised to even see Sharman be low on marks on the lead. Because when everyone talks about him, it's very much, he's the one leading. He's the leader. He's the one that's always trying to make the space. But he's not even getting that many marks on a lead. So either we're not honouring the leads that are there, or there are no leads coming. So it's kind of just building that chemistry between ball in hand and the forward. I feel like we kind of got going a little bit, but overall it's still severely lacking. You see some of the best teams, they move it quick. Give the defense no time. We give defenses 30 seconds to get back and they flood it. There's too many players there, so you're not going to get much space. You get a crumb, you get 1 meter of space and you get pinned. So we can't have that, You're not going to score much from having 30 players in the 50 arc. That's what happens. Every club does it. In 2024, the sum of St Kilda's forward line output had 17 out of 51 important forward stats above that of a top 4 forward line. With this lineup for 2025, the Saints' projected sum would see a minor increase to 19 out of 51. Considering the loss of Membry could potentially be covered by Marshall going forward, and also because his minutes are going to Travaglia, in the grand scheme of things, hopefully it addresses some of the forward movement issues that we've mentioned.
Okay, so what did we learn?
So, before we go over some final numbers, upon reflection, what have we learned? With a solid defensive output of 25 out of 37, or roughly 67% of important defensive stats above a top 4 defense, and with the potential reduction to 20 out of 37, or roughly 54%, St Kilda would want to see better results up the ground so they aren't tested as often. Thankfully, the Saints have somewhat addressed this area with the addition of Macrae and the more recent development of Matthias Philippou into a competent mid. In 2024, St Kilda had 9 out of 42, or roughly 21% of important mid stats above a top 4 midfield. With this lineup, and just using the last 5 games from Poo, that jumps to 15 out of 42, or roughly 35% above that of a top 4 midfield. They do need to use the ball better going forward though, and take advantage of every ruck contest. When looking at ruck stats, Marshall had 29 out of 43, or roughly 67% of important ruck stats above that of a top 4 ruck, and 18 out of 43, or roughly 42% of a top 4 ruck group. Again, from all accounts, St Kilda has also invested in this area, so I'm keen to see what Marshall can do in a hybrid ruck key forward role, a la the Paddy Ryder days. With 17 out of 51, or roughly 33% of important forward stats above a top 4 forward line, it looks like there is potential for improvement here despite the departure of Membry. I am also interested to see if St Kilda might look at smaller lineups in the future. Either way, this does seem like a good step in the right direction. In total, we used 70 player stats against a top 4 player in the same role to determine the effectiveness of the 6 different player types that we use. We also used player cumulative averages to see if they surpass the expected output of a top 4 defense, midfield, ruck line, and forward line to see if the group might work well together or not. Technically, we can look at all those 7 important stats across all lines and see how the whole team fares against an average top 4 side. In 2024, the sum of the Saints' output had 18 out of 70, or roughly 25% of important stats above a top 4 side. With this lineup for 2025, the projected sum of St Kilda's output would see them with 22 out of 70, or roughly 31% of important stats above a top 4 side. So, as a general, I think St Kilda are on the up, and with the litany of recent draft picks, who I have faith in, we could see them rocket up before anybody knows. I think St Kilda does have one of the widest possible ranges of finishes, and realistically, I wouldn't be surprised to see them anywhere.
Be honest.
Okay, maybe top or bottom 4 to be honest.
There's the truth of it.
So Jake, what do you think of all that? Was I fairly close to the mark or not?
It's kind of on us. We lost a lot of close games this year, and if we're better for it next year and we know how to handle those moments a little better and convert better, then I think we weren't far off this year, and we had a supposedly horrible year by all reports. You know, we were what, a game and a half, 2 games out really? And a bit of percentage. So I can't imagine we'd be further back this year. I don't think teams around us are going to improve out of sight. They're just going to be around us, and we play all of them. So we're just going to beat them.
Cheers, mate. I'll do some prediction videos as we get closer to the next season, but Wheeler Ratings has us with a 43.6% chance of making the finals and an 18.5% chance of making the top 4. Again, thank you so much for joining us, Jake. If you somehow know me and don't know him, he's looking to get 13,000 subs before the start of the season, and we're looking to break that 1,000 mark. So I am hoping the Saints fans might be able to help us get over the line. My name's Woody, this is Wooden Spoon Data, and if you'd like some of the videos that we've done and want to see more data-focused AFL content, the subscribe button keeps you up to date. I think the notification bell does a better job, actually. And YouTube suggests some videos that you might be interested in. So if you are, go have a look. Thanks again, have a good day.
When the Saints come marching in, I want to be in that number. When the Saints come marching in, when the Saints come marching in, when those Saints come marching in.
Hey, those cats are pretty cool.
Yeah.